Thank you very much. Thank you, Duncan, Adam, Orestes, Andy. It's been a great conference so far. So let me begin with something easy. The hypothesis of extended cognition. The hypothesis is that under certain conditions, cognitive processes are implemented by processes in the brain-body world. This formulation is very close, I think, to the way Rupert has articulated it as the idea that human cognitive processing literally extends into the environment surrounding the organism, and human cognitive states literally comprise, as we'll do their counterparts, elements in that environment. This is a hypothesis that Andy defends, at least at times, in Supersizing the Mind. Now, I think it's important to draw a contrast between that hypothesis and the various ways of articulating the conditions under which cognition is supposed to extend. So there are two broad families, I think, of conditions. One is cognitive equivalence conditions. So these are the arguments that work from Inga and Otto. So the idea is that Inga and Otto are, say, in all relevant and important respects, the same. But sometimes I think people have backed off of that and said things like, well, no, that they are in some important and relevant respects the same, say, in terms of, say, folk psychology, or maybe in terms of a liberal function. I don't care about those nuances here. Just draw your attention to cognitive equivalence conditions. More prominent will be conditions of trusting. There are a couple of variations on this. There's the three-condition version and then the four-condition version. And I'm assuming that everyone knows these three conditions. Okay, so here's the first part. We should draw a distinction between Peck and the various conditions of cognitive extension. And I think I want to point out that there are times when epistemologists who have worked to combine extended cognition and epistemology have claimed to be working on drawing a connection between extended cognition and epistemology, but that when you pay attention to the argumentation, what they're really looking at is at the conditions of trusting glue and their implication for epistemology. So in theory, you can abandon trusting glue, as I think you should, and see what happens there. So just for a point of clarity, you should distinguish between these two versions of what the epistemologists are doing. And I think, in fact, that Palermos and Carter, Calistrep, Palermos, and Pritchard, I think they're actually, say they're doing the first of these, and they're actually doing the second. Okay, so that's just the first point. So the first thing I want to do is make this clarificatory point. That really what people are doing is looking at the trusting glue and extended cognition and their implications for epistemology. Then I've got a minor comment. I think some of these arguments are flawed. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I think it's minor. And in fact, I'm going to cut out one thing I think is a flaw. But then I want to move on to a cautionary point. And that's that I'm going to try to provide some new reasons for thinking that the conditions of trusting glue do not provide a plausible account of when cognitive processes extend. And I think, in fact, the trusting glue conditions are just another iteration of the coupling constitution fallacy. Okay, so I'm going to spend more time on that because you can see it, raised eyebrows for Andy. Okay, good. So trusting glue in epistemology. So Palermo's 2012. So Orestes claims that Heck and the broader framework of virtue or reliabilism share some intriguing similarities, which render these two views mutually supportive. He then goes on to claim that in order for non-biological elements to be included in one's cognitive system, their deployment must meet the same criteria as the ones that the belief-forming process must satisfy so as to count as knowledge conducive. So it looks as though what he's trying to say is that when you meet the conditions of cognitive extension, you're meeting the conditions of virtue epistemology. It looks like that's what he's saying. And there are times, I think, when Duncan, in his 2010 paper, says something that can be interpreted that way. It's a little looser. He says there's a snug fit between virtue epistemology and extended cognition, but that metaphor leaves some rigor. Okay. But I think it's clear that what Palermos is doing is not comparing standard Heck per se, but that he's actually looking at intriguing similarities between virtue reliabilism and Heck plus the conditions of trusting glue. Okay. So here's Palermo's version of virtue reliabilism. Condition 1. The belief-forming process is that virtue reliabilism requires that a belief-forming process that is properly integrated within the agent's cognitive character. So I'm just going to toggle over the text, but that's not working. But here's what he says. So then you might ask, what is it to be properly integrated within an agent's cognitive character? Well, there he proposed that first it's the conditions of trust and glue, and then he adds a fourth condition, continuous reciprocal causation. So Orestes says that it's a 3 plus 1 condition that articulates this notion of proper integration. Then he adds condition 2. This is a standard version of reliabilism, more or less. I mean, again, a lot of ways to articulate reliabilism, but it's a reliabilism condition. And then condition 3 is that the belief-forming process has to be a stable disposition. Okay. And so again, here's what Palermo says, and here's, I think, what the shorter version, this is how I'm interpreting what he's saying, is that the conditions for cognitive extension are the same as the conditions for virtue knowing. I think that's what he's getting at, and I think this is a view that's wrong. And I think there are 3 ways of seeing what's wrong with this. First of all, this can't be right, because the conditions of cognitive extension are a proper subset of the conditions of virtue epistemology. So if you go back here, right, there's a reason I laid it out this way, is this whole thing can't be equivalent to the subset. Right? I think that's pretty straightforward. Right? You just can't do that. Unless these, of course, are totally backwards, which I don't think they are. Okay. Second way of thinking about this. It looks as though Orestes' conditions preclude extended foolishness. By extended foolishness, I mean you have an extended cognitive agent close to the beliefs or false. Right? If those conditions were coextensive, you just wouldn't have extended fools. But I think you can. Okay, all that's sort of theoretical, so let's do a thought experiment. Let's do an example, right, which makes this more or less concrete, and it's more of the cycling doofus. So, a cycling computer is basically a speedometer plus odometer. And Ford is minimally mechanically competent, so you can attach a little magnet to the spoke of the front wheel, and then you can attach the sensor to the fork, and then you can attach the LCD to the handlebars. And it seems in this situation that Mort is now about a putative instance of cognitive extension. So the computer is reliably available and typically invoked whenever Mort is cycling. Mort more or less automatically endorses the speed and distance readings of the cycling computer. He never subjects them to critical scrutiny, so he does not usually subject them to critical scrutiny. Moreover, he deems what the computer says to be about as trustworthy as something retrieved from biological memory. And the computer has large, clearly visible LCD display so that the information from the computer is easily accessible and as and when required. And then we can add in the reciprocal causal, continuous reciprocal causation by adding that the readings on the cycling computer influence how hard and fast Mort rides. Okay, so I think here you satisfy the conditions of cognitive extension. But now I want to argue that Mort doesn't satisfy the reliability condition. Why? Well, being a doofus, he does not know that he's supposed to calibrate the cycling computer to the size of the wheel. So the readings of the computer are always slightly wrong. So he doesn't satisfy the reliability condition. So again, I think you can see that the conditions for Palermo's extended cognition are not the same as the conditions for Pritchard's virtue epistemology. So I think there are 3 ways of seeing this. Here's another way of seeing the general character of the problem. It is that Mort trusts a device that is not trustworthy. But Palermo seems to think that this situation cannot arise. That the processes under consideration are supposed to be cognitive dispositions, habits of the agent, which he has repeatedly employed in the past. So had it been problematic, the agent would have noticed that and responded appropriately. So the idea is if you use your cycling computer all the time, you're just going to notice that it's off. Well, no. You're only going to notice if it's off if it's really way off, if you check it versus, say, landmarks, if you check it versus Google Maps, if you check it versus Strava. You somehow have an independent check. But you can use a cycling computer all the time and have no idea how far off it is. And I think this is actually probably a general phenomenon, right? There is what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? It's where people are bad at something and they're not really very good at detecting that they are bad at something. And sometimes this is colorfully called the, what's it called? The double whammy of incompetence. Sorry, it's because you're bad at something and you're bad at seeing that you're bad at something. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in metacognition about how bad we are at calibrating themselves. So I don't think that using a thing all the time is going to guarantee you finding out your errors. Okay, so it seems to me that simple point, Palermo does not explore the implications of EC for epistemology per se, the implications of EC per se for epistemology, but the implications of EC plus trust and glue for epistemology. And then I think he actually makes a sort of minor mistake about aligning virtue epistemology and the conditions of EC plus trust and glue. Okay. Carter, Callister, Palermo, and Pritchard have a very extensive paper that explores various forms of externalism in epistemology and various forms of externalism in the philosophy of mind. Can't go through all of that, but I just want to draw attention to one argument. One is that that's based on the hypothesis of extended cognition on the psychology side of things and accessibilist J-internalism on the epistemological side of things. And they point out that accessibilist J-internalism is view that whenever an agent holds a justified belief, she must be in a position to know just by reflection alone that it justifies her belief. And at one point they argue fairly far on in section 4, they explore a thesis that extended cognition entails justification externalism. Now they don't buy this thesis, they just explore this thesis, and I think they ultimately find flaws with this thesis. So I wouldn't want to say, I don't want to attribute this kind of argument to them, so I in the body of this text, I describe this as the entailor's argument. So it's not CKPP's argument, it's someone else's argument, but they're just exploring. Okay. But what I want to show or draw attention to is how the argument is supposed to work. And they run what they call a twin auto argument. So there's an auto and auto star, both suffer from Alzheimer's disease. Auto is supposed to have extended cognition, but auto star apparently is not. And auto is the Clark and Chalmers auto, and auto star is just like auto accept. He doesn't satisfy, apparently, either the conditions of trust and glue or the conditions of cognitive equivalence. Okay, so what so the idea is you really need the conditions of trust and glue and cognitive equivalence to run this argument. So that's the main point. Okay, that they are really exploring not just EC and epistemology, but EC and functional equivalence and trust and glue. And here's how the argument runs. And here's how I'm just going to do the setup so you can see how the role it plays. I don't want to try to refute them or go through the whole thing there. Because I think there are other things that you find more interesting. Okay, so twin auto. Auto's biological memory is failing, so is auto stars, in both cases due to Alzheimer's. Auto, however, from Clark and Chalmers' 1998 original example, relies on a notebook to store energy and information in a way that is functionally equivalent to the way he used to before Alzheimer's, relying on his biological brain. Now, in describing auto, there is no allusion to trust and glue here, right? It's just not there. But auto star, however, usually can't be bothered carrying a notebook around, and accordingly, his world is comparatively less organized. Auto star agreed to meet at the Museum of Modern Art on 53rd Street. Otto writes his down as he does. Otto, uncharacteristic for him, buys a notebook, and on this occasion writes down that the Museum of Modern Art is on 53rd Street. 5 minutes later, at time T, neither Otto nor Otto Star have the address of the Museum of Modern Art in biological storage, but at T they both know they can simply consult their respective notebooks later when the information is needed. So I think you can see in the setup that implicit here when Otto Star is being described, Otto Star does not satisfy the conditions of trust and glue. So in the background, the way that the mechanics of this argument works is it's really depending on functional equivalence and trust and glue. So it's not just the argument. So when you actually run through the justification they give for this moral average argument, you can see that they are appealing to cognitive equivalence and trust and glue. Okay, so again, I think I'm not going to run through this whole argument showing what I think is wrong with it, because I think if actually CKPP also think there are problems with the argument, so that's not all that interesting. So they're probably basic examples. So here's what I want to do. I tried to go through this clarificatory point that conditions of trust and glue have come to play in discussions of extended cognition and epistemology. I think that's pretty uncontroversial, so I just wanted to point out some cases where it did happen. But now I want to introduce maybe a cautionary. Maybe cautionary is not a strong word, but it's the conditions of trust and glue, the version of the coupling constitution fallacy. Okay, so I don't think Fred and I maybe paid enough attention to these conditions, but we'll try to fix that. So, everyone I think knows the simple coupling constitution fallacy. Okay? It's a process of type Y can be coupled to a process of type X without the Y process, or the whole YX process, and I've not been fully articulate about this whole part. Thereby coming to the B at the same time. Take an example, distillation. Process of distillation, process of evaporation. In distillation, the process of evaporation is coupled to a process of condensation, but that does not make the evaporation process into a condensation process, nor does it make the combination of evaporation and condensation into a process of condensation. And you can get sort of a similar story, I think, about psychology, change of digits in an LCD display of a speedometer. They cause the influence of a person to believe that a car is accelerating, but the changing of the LCD is not therefore a cognitive process, nor is the whole combined process of LCDs changing in the change of beliefs a cognitive process. Now, there's a very simple reply to this, and it's pretty common. Andy's got this reply. It's that no one makes this mistake. Now, it's certainly true, and this, I think, is one important fact to which Kenneth Aizawa's argument quite properly draws the reader's attention. That not just any old kind of coupling will achieve this result. But as far as I'm aware, nobody in the literature has ever claimed otherwise. Well, right. I think Alvin Noe does make this mistake, but that doesn't really matter. The important point, I think, is to see that this is the first step in the argument. It's not the end of the argument. So that in the Bounds of Cognition, we have 2 chapters working through all these iterations of how you add a whistle and a bell and see whether adding the whistle and a bell helps. And in fact, Justin Fisher says that refers to these chapters. I do not want to talk about these chapters in my review of this book. It's just 2 chapters of trench warfare. And that's exactly what it is. Okay, it's a long slog. Okay, but the important point is to see that the simple fallacy is the start. It's the opening move to get you to see the structure of the problem. And so you want to see, okay, is there a way of adding a whistle or a bell to fix this? So consider 2 popular whistles and bells. The first, continuous reciprocal causation. Orestes likes this, and I found yesterday that Mark likes this. A second popular strategy is to appeal to higher level properties of the system. Okay? And this came out in 3 papers all about the same time 2 summers ago. Okay, I was stunned that the same idea came out 3 times. It's close together. Okay. But these are whistles and bells, I think, that do not work. So, go back to Aizawa 2001. Okay. If you look at the structure of the examples, right, we have 2 of them. They're the process of the thermostat and process of infiltration of impurities from the blood. Consider the expansion of a bimetallic strip in the thermostat. This process is causally linked to a heater or air conditioner that regulates the temperature of the room the thermostat is in. Expansion does not thereby become a process that extends into the whole of the system. It is still restricted to the bimetallic strip in the thermostat. Take another example. The kidney filters impurities from the blood. In addition, this filtration is causally influenced by the heart's pumping of the blood, the size of the blood vessels, the circulatory system, the one-way valves, the circulatory system, and so forth. And if you think about this example, you can see it's a case of reciprocal causation. Circular reciprocal, because the bimetallic strip influences the heater, and the heater influences the bimetallic strip. And filtration of the blood influences the heart, right? Filter the blood and preserve the heart rate. So we set up these examples with malice aforethought. Knowing this is, if you just think to the example, you'll see how it works. Okay. Okay. Well, that's one way of getting at it. Here's another thing. Take a process of, say, carrying on a conversation. Carrying on a conversation clearly involves continuous reciprocal causation. I say something, you hear it, you say something, I hear it, back and forth. Okay. So clearly that's extended. It goes outside into the environment. But ask some other question. Where does the process of phototransduction take place? Where does the process of phototransduction take place? It's in the photoreceptors, in the rods and cones. Where does the process of ordinary auditory transduction take place? In the ear. Where does the process of sound wave propagation take place? In the atmosphere. And where does the cognitive process take place? Well, you could say, in the brain. So what you really need is some account of why saying the whole process of carrying on a conversation is cognitive, as opposed to just what's going on in the brain. And it looks like, to answer that question, you need a mark of the cognitive. Take another sort of case. In 2009 paper, Rob Wilson argues for extended vision. And he talks about the visual perception cycle involving continuous reciprocal causation. So I see stuff, I move around, I pick it up, and then I see more stuff, then I move around and pick stuff up. So you alternate perceiving and acting, perceiving and acting. Well, clearly I think that's extended. But then you can ask the same sorts of questions as we've done before. Where does the process of phototransduction take place? It takes in the photoreceptors. Where does light propagation take place? In the atmosphere. Where does ATP hydrolysis take place? Cells, maybe. Where does cognitive processing take place? In the brain. So you just cannot assume that the whole perception action cycle involves continuous reciprocal causation. Right? You have to think that here's an option. That you have a causal reciprocal causation. You have a causal loop that involves causal mechanisms of different types. That there are different types of causal processes making up the causal loop. Some are cognitive, some are non-cognitive. You have to have a reason to think that the whole thing is cognitive. That is the mark of the cognitive system. Okay, bell number 2. Here's an argument that I think that many attribute to Richard. And it says, look, here's the picture. When process Y and process X interact, it's not as though there's a transformation of X or Y. It is instead that there's a higher level process Z that is created. That Z comes to be realized by X and Y, or implemented by X and Y. So, to turn it back to Otto's case, Otto's brain processes interact with the processes in the notebook, and it thereby creates a new brain-body environment system that has new processes not had by Otto alone or by his notebook alone. And I think that Richard, is that your view?
It's close enough, yeah.
Was it? Okay. Good. And 3 people have taken this on this view. Tom Prosy, Rosenblatt, and Gershenson, Joel Kruger, and Orestes Palermo's taking this view on. Now, in fact, this is a picture that's very familiar from the New Mechanism literature in the philosophy of science. And here's the famous image from Craver 2007. And that you have a process of S's signing is mechanistically explained by parts of S fining. So you have x1 fining and x1 phi 1ing, x2 phi 2ing. And so you can see the picture. It's S would be Otto in his notebook. The sign would be cognizing. Phi 1, so x1 phi 1ing might be, say, something going on in Otto's brain, and x2 might be the notebook, psi 2ing, whatever that being stretched on. Okay? So you can see how this picture does a pretty reasonable job of capturing Richard and Orestes and Tom's and Joel's view. Okay. But actually, it turns out that in this view, some people seem to think that CRC is part of this picture. You can only get this emergence of a higher level process with CRC. But that's not right. If you see in this picture, this is not the standard assumption in at least the New Mechanism literature. This is all entire linear causation. And you can take an example, distillation you might think is a higher level process, and it's implemented by evaporation and condensation. There's no reciprocal causation here. Okay, so I think CRC is optional for this. Okay, but here's the question now. Why do you think that S's fine is Otto's in a notebook cognizing? In fact, why not think that S's sign is the same thing as Otto in his notebook system behaving? Okay, so look, it's a pretty standard distinction that there's a distinction between, it's a pretty standard distinction that cognition is not the same thing as behavior. So how is it that S's sign is a notebook cognizing, is him cognizing, plus rather than his notebook and him behaving? Standard question, right? But I think you can make it more pressing. So part of making the question more pressing is pointing out the distinction between cognition and behavior. Here's another way of making the issue more pressing. In the mechanistic literature, well, let's point out, first of all, that Andy and many of the extended cognition folks are willing to accept that X1 phi, that is the brain, is undergoing psychological processing. Andy's willing to accept that. Then it's typical in the mechanistic literature to suppose that X1's phi-ing, X1's X1ing, sorry, and X2's X2ing gives rise to a qualitatively distinct process of S's sign. Okay, so in fact, Prochet, Gersonson, and Rosenbluth mention this explicitly. But they also mention that X1 phi 1 is cognitive processing. So, okay, if you accept both these two things, that really puts pressure on the idea that this is cognitive processing, that this is going on down here gives rise to something qualitatively distinct, that this better not be cognizing too. It's not a deductive argument in the sense, but it's a sense it's a motivational point. Right? The standard story is X1 phi 1 is not going to give rise to S's sign. And I've talked about this before in 2009. I've called this a fractal conception. Right? That what's going on in the brain is just the same thing as what's going on in a system, which might be the same thing as going on in a society. And I don't think that phrase ever caught on. But that's the question. So again, you're committing a fallacy if you think that just doing this coupling sort of stuff down here, giving rise to a higher level process, guarantees you're going to get the the notebook plus auto system cognized. Okay. Okay, so I've argued that CRC does not avoid the coupling constitution fallacy. I've argued that the implementation of high-level processes do not avoid the coupling constitution fallacy. So what about the conditions of trusting glue? Okay, so this is sort of warm up to that. I think no. The conditions of trusting glue do not commit a simple version of the fallacy, since the conditions actually are not pure coupling conditions. And I think that the label trust in glue is somewhat misleading, because it suggests that all that is involved in cognitive extension is a matter of properly glomming onto a thing. Okay. But it's more than just glomming onto any old kind of thing. One must glom onto an information resource. So I think I'm just making explicit what Andy believes, and he seems to be agreeing. Okay, so good. I'm asking about this more. So let me make the point a little more concrete. It's not that just one must glom onto something. One must glom onto an information resource, and you can see this in conditions 2 and 3. So it's that any information thus retrieved should be more or less automatically endorsed. It should not be subject to critical scrutiny. And number 3, that information contained in the resource should be easily accessible as and when required. So that's sort of the theoretical take on it. Take an example, a thought experiment, articulate this. So here's a putative case of extended cognition, I think, that Andy would buy. Imagine Nigel, who bakes a cake using a recipe he's written in a book. Suppose he meets the familiar trusting glue conditions. In such a case, Nigel's use of the recipe book will apparently count as an instance of extended cognition. I think that's standard fare. Now consider a non-starter case of extended cognition. Turn now from the cookbook to Nigel's oven. Suppose that the oven is reliably available and typically used when Nigel bakes cakes. Suppose that Nigel deems it as trustworthy as an oven as though memory is as trustworthy as memory. Okay, so it's sort of an odd comparison maybe, but that's maybe essentially the point. Suppose that the oven is easily accessible as and when required, and suppose finally this fourth condition, going in just for good measure, that this oven has been endorsed as the best-in-class oven, and that it's because of this that Nigel uses it for baking. Now, as I understand Andy's view, the Nigel's use of his oven differs from Nigel's use of cookbook. Why? Because Nigel's oven is a resource for baking, whereas Nigel's cookbook is an information resource. There is apparently something about the nature of the cognitive processes within the resource that matters to cognitive status in Andy's eyes. Heating processes are not suited to being cognitive, where information manipulation processes are. Okay, so far Andy seems to be okay with this. Okay, but now Andy complains against us that Adams and Aizawa seem to suggest, implausibly, that some objects or processes, in virtue of their own nature, are, as I shall now put it, at least candidate parts for inclusion in a cognitive process. And they think that other objects or processes, still in virtue of their own nature, are not even candidates. But what I've just argued is that Clark agrees with that. Okay, that for Clark, information bearing processes are candidates for being cognitive processes, where heating processes are not. So I'm trying to nudge Andy a little bit closer to us. Okay. So here's where I think we are. I think Andy and Adams and Aizawa agree that we need more more than trusting glue alone, trusting glue construed just as glomming on. Instead, we need at least some further characteristic of something further about the nature of the processes. We need at least trust of and glue to processes that have a characteristic nature. Okay, and so here's where I think the difference is coming down. That Clark takes this nature to consist of information processing, whereas Adams and I think that nature consists of a restricted class of information processing over non-derived representation. So I'm trying to push Andy closer and closer to us. Okay, so this is pretty close. But I think Andy is still mistaken. You need more than just this. So that's what I'm going to argue now. So who is correct on this score? I want to appeal to a thought experiment along the Inga-Otto lines, only this time invoking the possibility of extended knowledge. So consider a case, Opie, this will be an Opie notice case. Americans will know Opie notices. Opie is the son of Andy Taylor on the Andy Griffith Show, and Otis is the town hall. Okay, so Opie enrolls in an organic chemistry class on the first day, and on the first day he learns there will be an exam in 1 month. He comes to class every day and spends some time each night for the next month studying his organic chemistry text, memorizing all the information that he can. When the fateful day arrives, he correctly recalls enough of the material on the exam to enable him to get a 92 on his exam. Standard story about learning in college. Otis enrolls in the organic chemistry class, and on the first day he learns that there will be an exam in 1 month. Rather than go to class, however, he always cuts class and sleeps in. Rather than study, he copies little note cards based on the information he cribs from his textbook. When the fateful day arrives, Otis is able to sort through his cards just quickly enough and quickly enough to enable him to get a 92 on his exam. Now, it seems to me that Opie is a diligent student and knows a respectable amount of chemistry, whereas Otis is a cheating slut of it. When the professor returns the exams, she noticed that Otis has an A, but she does not recall having seen Otis in class. So she asks Otis if he's been to class very often, and Otis forthrightly admits that he is not. Then the professor asks Otis how he was able to get an A on his first exam, and Otis explains. He basically copied out his note cards for the exam and he read them during the exam. Outraged, the professor called Otis a cheater and threatens to change the grade to a 0. But, Otis says, the information in my note cards functions just like the information constituting an ordinary, non-occurrent belief in Opie. It just happens that the information lies beyond my skin. Professor, the information constituting an ordinary, non-occurrent belief is subject to various psychological laws that do not apply to you in your note card system. No one of those features may be essential to saying that you have requisite beliefs about organic chemistry, but they're nevertheless important and relevant. Otis, I kept the note cards reliably available for the exam and consulted them as needed to answer the questions on the exam. I didn't leave any space blank on the exam until after I had consulted the note card. That's irrelevant to knowing the answers. But I had the cards easily accessible and endorsed the exam as and when required. I automatically endorsed what was on the cards, trusting what was on them more than what any of my fellow students might say. I trust the cards as much as my own biological memory. Again, irrelevant to your knowing the answers. You can see how it is. But I endorsed what I wrote on the cards when I wrote them up. That too is irrelevant. Look, tests are meant to be tests of the relevant cognitive capacities, and you did not exercise those cognitive capacities. Instead, you cheated. But you need to really think about the larger system constituted by me and my notebook. Yes, your overall performance using your notebook got an A, but your overall performance did not involve the cognitive capacities that were the subject of the tests. That is why you failed. End of story. Okay, here's a general moral. The organic chemistry test is like many experimental tests in cognitive psychology. One generally wants more than mere behavioral equivalence. One wants more than performance. One generally wants experiments that probe underlying cognitive capacities. And actual performance are often deemed unhelpful if they do not illuminate the underlying cognitive capacities. Try again. Here's another one. The trainer. Clever Hans. How much is 3 plus 2? Clever Hans. Okay? We do not care whether Clever Hans can tap his foot the appropriate number of times in a We care about more than some possible behavioral equivalence between clever Hans and a horse with genuine mathematical ability. We care about the underlying cognitive capacities. In fact, it was an important discovery that Hans is doing this not by knowing how to do addition, but by instead relying on behavioral cues from the trainer, in fact, from anybody. Because everyone apparently, when the 10's coming up, the correct number's coming up, people sort of lean forward, and when it gets there, there's a relaxing thing, and Hans can respond to that. That's an important discovery. It's like part of undergraduate psychology, right, to know about the clever Hans experiment. So, I think we can't go for behavioral equivalence. We should look for underlying cognitive capacity. Okay, so to conclude, I have a number of goals. First of all, my one, essentially the difference between the hypothesis of extended cognition as the view that under certain circumstances, cognitive processes are implemented in the brain-body world, and the hypothesis and these putative conditions under which the cognitive process might be thought to extend. Goal 1b, some discussions of extended cognition in the epistemology and literature do not merely look at extended cognition, but at extended cognition in conjunction with conditions of trust and glue. And then I've noted some difficulties with arguments that affect epistemology and cognition in conditions of trust and glue. And then I'm going to try, as the goal 2, to draw attention to failed attempts to solve the Coupling Constitution fallacy. I've argued that CRC is a bell, implication parallel cognitive process is a whistle, and that the conditions of trust and glue don't work. And I tried to use this argument with the opioid thought experiment and clever Hans